So good to worship God together. It's so good to be here and be with our family this morning. I want to start. Has anyone ever seen the 1956 movie with Charlton Heston in it, the Ten Commandments? Yeah, I got some nods. Appreciate that. Yeah, Ten Commandments. Or maybe the 1998 movie. It's The Prince of Egypt. It's an animated film about the same thing. Yeah, yeah. Well, I really like to watch those kind of movies where they try to portray things from the Bible. And I know we got to be really careful because they like to take artistic license. They like to take things away from what the scriptures say. Sometimes they add things in. We have to be careful, but sometimes it can make it more real to me. I don't know, maybe for you, if this is the same for you, but sometimes it makes people seem more human or the events seem more real. And I guess it was about 2 weeks ago now, I was doing some reading, just daily Bible reading, and I came across Exodus 14. And so if you open your Bibles to Exodus 14, that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time. And in Exodus 14, this is where they cross over the Red Sea. And if you remember from the Charlton Heston movie and the Prince of Egypt, they portray this. And so after I was reading this, I noticed some things that I just never noticed before. Some different things hit me in a way that I hadn't really thought of before. And so I rewatched some of the clips from those movies, and I really liked some things they did, and I really didn't like some things they did. And so I thought this morning what we would do is we would go through Exodus 14, look at the crossing of the Red Sea, and then try to visualize it and see what it is that we can learn from it. I want us to kind of make a movie in our mind from what we read and what it says specifically. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 14. Let me see if this is, let's see. I'm going to X out of this real quick. And I'm also appreciative for this light too. I think Bob is the one who set it up together. And so I know that we've all genuinely benefited from this. It's really helpful. Let me just pull this up really quick here, and then I'll switch it back. Okay. So we're going to be talking about crossing the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 14. So just a little bit of context for what's going on here. We all probably remember God spoke to Moses through the burning bush. He said, go to the Pharaoh in Egypt where the enslaved Egyptians are. Tell him to let my people go so that they can come and serve me. Moses and Aaron, they go and perform these signs in front of Pharaoh, in front of the Israelites, so that they knew they were from God. But Pharaoh hardened his heart, didn't let the people go. It says several times that Pharaoh hardened his heart, but God did these 10 plagues, and it says, I think it's about 7, 8 times that he did these plagues so that they would know that he is the Lord. And yet Pharaoh was still hardened until the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. Then he finally lets the people go. And so after that, we see that the Egyptians really want the Israelites to leave, and the Israelites plunder them on the way out. If you'll actually turn to chapter 12 really quick, Exodus chapter 12, and we'll start in verse 35. Exodus 12, we'll start in verse 35, just to kind of set us up to when we get to Exodus 14. So here in Exodus 12, down in verse 35 starting, it says, now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. They baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened since they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. So we see that they plunder the Egyptians. They've got a lot of stuff now. And it says there's 600,000 men aside from children. And some people also argue that that's aside from women as well. And so you can read where it's anywhere from 1 million to probably 3 million people, 1 million to 3 million people that are leaving Egypt. And now they've got all this stuff. So it would take them some time to travel. And especially if you've got kids and you're trying to travel with stuff, and it would have taken them some time to move and go. And so in chapter 13, at the end of chapter 13, it says that God was leading them in a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud by day and night to lead them where they're going. And we see where God leads them is going to be really important in chapter 14. They get to the edge of the wilderness by the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea, as we're going to read. And that's where we get to chapter 14. The setting is going to be important as we read these first couple of verses. So let's start in chapter 14 and let's read in verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. You shall camp in front of Baal-zephon, opposite it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And they did so. So just here in these first 4 verses, we see God telling Moses exactly where to base camp. And it's important because he says to the Pharaoh, it's going to look like the Israelites are just wandering aimlessly and they don't know what they're doing. And so his heart's going to become hardened. He's going to say, why did we let these people go? They're just wandering aimlessly. Let's go wrangle them back up. Let's go do this. And God is the one who's actually orchestrating this. And in verse 4, he says, I'm going to be honored through Pharaoh and his army, and they're going to know that I'm the Lord. And so as we keep reading, we're going to see that exactly what God said would happen is exactly what happened. So read with me in verse 5, starting here. Verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people. And they said, what is this we have done? And that we have let Israel go from serving us. Verse 6. So he made his chariots ready and took his people with him. And he took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he chased after the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out boldly. Then the Egyptians chased after them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen, and his army. And they overtook them, camping by the sea, beside Pi-hahiroth, in front of Baal-zephon. And so here in verses 5 through 9, it happens just like God said to Moses. The Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He gathers 600 of his finest chariots. And it also says all the other chariots in Egypt, and they have officers in each one. So this is a trained military. These are people who know what they're doing. There's officers in these chariots, all kinds of chariots. I mean, the most modern militaristic strategy and equipment that they could have, they had it. And so they go down and they're actually able to move much faster than these Israelites are moving because they overtake them. They catch up to them where God has told them to be camped. And we're going to see Israel's reaction to seeing the Egyptians coming after them in the next couple of verses. So let's read in verse 10 starting. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. And for the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. And so the Israelites, they see these Egyptians coming. And I mean, remember, this is 600 plus chariots coming after them. And this has got to be scary. And they're terrified. They're frightened. It says in verse 10, they cried out to the Lord. That seems like a great thing for them to do. But then immediately in verse 11, we see them complaining and grumbling against Moses right away. They're like, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us out here so that we could die here? And they say, didn't we tell you while we were in Egypt that it would be better for us to die here than for us to die out there in the wilderness? And so they're grumbling, they're complaining against Moses. But Moses says, look, do not fear. Stand by and watch what's going to happen. Verse 13, see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. Watch this, because the Egyptians that you see, you're never going to see them again forever. He says what's going to happen. And I love verse 14. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. The Lord's going to do all of the saving. He's going to do all of this. And we get to see God's reaction to their reaction in the next verses right here. So let's read starting in verse 15. Verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. As for you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. As for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, when I am honored through Pharaoh, through his chariots and his horsemen. The angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there was the cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus the one did not come near the other all night. So God says, why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to go forward. I think it's kind of humorous. Why are you crying out to me? Go forward. Do the thing that I'm telling you to do. Go forward. But he tells Moses, he says, lift out your staff and your hand, stretch it over. You're going to divide the sea, and you're going to walk through on dry ground. God says, I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they go in after you. And he says again, I will be honored through Pharaoh and his army. And they're going to know that I am the Lord when I'm honored through Pharaoh and the army. And it says the angel of God, who at the end of verse 13 is said to be the Lord. And we're going to see later that it's the Lord. The angel of God moves from in front of them, where he was telling them where to go and where to camp, to behind them, and is in between the camp of Israel and the camp of the Egyptians. And one of the things that I think some of these movies or shows, when they do this, they don't catch is here in the end of verse 20, that it gave light at night, and the one did not come near the other all night. So this is an event that likely takes all night long. We're going to see it more as we keep going, but this is an event that took all night. Think about 1 million plus people crossing a sea with all their stuff and their kids and how long that would take. And God is dividing the camps while this is going on all night long. This is really interesting. It's great stuff. And so let's keep reading here, and let's see this amazing event that's going to happen. Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Then the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. At the morning watch, verse 24, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians. So Moses does as God told him to, and the Lord sweeps the sea back, it says, with a strong east wind all night. Did you notice that? All night. And the sea was dry land, the waters were divided. Again, so it seems like this happens all night long. The Israelites walk through the sea on dry ground, and the waters were split like walls on either side of them. I mean, can you imagine what this would be like for them? It's really hard. That's why I kind of like these movies, is we get, maybe it looked like that, maybe it didn't. This is unbelievable. There's no naturalistic explanation for what's happening here. So just imagine that, first of all, there's this pillar of fire and cloud that's been leading you to where you need to go. And then you're terrified because the Egyptians are coming after you. That cloud moves from in front of you to behind you and is protecting you from them all night long. It's giving you light because it's nighttime. You hear, the sound of really strong winds, you hear that all night long coming from the east, separating the waters. It says it's stacked up like walls on either side. We don't know exactly what that is, but just, this is unreal. The ground you're walking on is completely dry. And this is all night long, and you walk across that. This is just unreal. There's no naturalistic explanation for what's happening here. And so then we see that the Egyptians, they take up their pursuit. It says specifically at the morning watch in verse 24, the Egyptians take up their pursuit and they go in after them. And again, could you imagine what it's like to be an Egyptian during this too? I mean, you just came out of Egypt where these 10 unbelievable plagues happened. And for most of the plagues, the Israelites had been separated and they weren't suffering, but the Egyptians did. And so now you're going after these Israelites, and there's been this cloud that's been separating you from them. And whenever you decide to go in after them and you see the sea split and there's dry. I mean, this is crazy. If I'm an Egyptian, I don't think I'm going in after them. I don't know about you all, but that's weird. I'm not going in after them. But their hearts were hardened, and they do. And we see that the Lord in verse 24, he looks down on them, and he brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion so that their chariot wheels are swerving and they can't control their chariots. They can't control these things that they should have been able to control. Remember, there's officers in these chariots. These guys know how to do this. but they can't. So much so that at the end of verse 25, even these Egyptians are saying, let us flee because the Lord is fighting against us. You remember how God said they're going to know that I'm the Lord and I'm going to be honored through them? I think they knew exactly what was happening. So they're going to run away. I think this is something that the movies don't do a good job of either. They initially go in, but because the Lord puts them into confusion, they're going to run away. They don't keep chasing them. They're running away from them because God is fighting against them. So let's keep reading here and let's see to the end of the chapter, verse 26 starting. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained. Verse 29, but the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So God tells Moses again to stretch his hand and the staff out over the waters, and they'll go back to the way that they were. And notice it says at daybreak. So this is something that took all night long. This was a long process for this to happen. And at daybreak, Moses does this. This whole crossing, this large number of people, the stuff they had, just thinking logistically how long it would take for 1 million plus people to get across. This took a long time. And we see in verse 27 that while the Egyptians were fleeing, the waters came back on them. They weren't continuing to chase. They knew something was up. They knew the Lord was working against them, and they're running away. The Lord overthrew them. The water goes back to normal, and everyone that went in after the Israelites, every single one of them were killed. Because it says at the end of verse 28, not even one of them remained. But the Israelites were safe, and they walked through on dry ground. So we get down to verse 30 and 31, and it says, thus the Lord saved Israel that day. I mean, we could just full stop, period, mic drop on that one, right? The Lord saved Israel that day. And it has nothing to do with what the Israelites did. Yes, they walked across, but it has nothing to do with what they did. The Lord did all of the saving, and Israel seized the bodies of the Egyptians and the great power of the Lord, and they feared him. They believed in the Lord. They believed in Moses. And this has just been one crazy night, right? This has been a crazy night. And so that's the Exodus. That's crossing the Red Sea. And this is a huge event in the scriptures because we're going to see throughout all of the rest of the Bible, there are going to be callbacks and remembrances to this event. And so because of that, there's definitely no way we could cover all of the important things that are in this text and all the important symbols, just all of that stuff. But there are some things that I'd like to pull out this morning, and maybe we'll do this again in a few months and we'll have completely different points and different applications. But today I've got 3 observations and then 3 applications that we can make from this passage. The first one here is that God causes hearts to harden. And I phrased it this way for a specific reason, because there are some people who they like to point to the Pharaoh of Egypt and they say, here's the case study. God said, let my people go, but then he supernaturally imposed his will on him so that he no longer had the choice to let them go. And so then he punished him because he didn't let them go. How can a God like that be fair? How can a God like that be just? Well, that's not really reading it the correct way. It's very clear that Pharaoh still had the free will to make choices, but he hardened himself. As a matter of fact, just in the chapters preceding this, by my imperfect count, it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart about 9 times. And then it says God hardened his heart about 8 times. And so we see it's very clear he still had the ability to make the choices, but he was hardened. And I think it might be easier for us to understand this as God caused his heart to harden. And this isn't my illustration, but I thought this was a really good one. Just for an example, some of these days that we've been having that are like 100 degrees, 100-degree heat. So if you take a stick of butter and you take a lump of clay and you put both of those on a patio on a 100-degree day, that sun, that same heat is going to melt the butter, but it's going to harden that clay. And I think in the same way, God causes some people to melt, to soften, and causes other people to harden. It's the idea of arrogance, pride, bucking against the reins. God is the ruler of the universe. He has the right to tell me what to do. No way. That's the hardening. Then there's the softening of, okay, God is the creator of the universe. He runs everything. And then we soften. And so I think that at the beginning of this chapter, we can see this to the effect here, because to Pharaoh, it looks like the Israelites are just wandering around aimlessly. He's like, well, I'm just going to go wrangle them up. They don't know what they're doing. When the reality is God had orchestrated it and knew what Pharaoh was going to do, but he didn't make the decision for him. He knew what he was going to do, but he didn't make the decision for him. And so the idea that God is over his people, he's the true ruler of the universe, and that God has the right to tell people how to live, causes some people to soften, and it causes some people to harden. The idea of stubbornness and pride. But another observation from this chapter is that God will be honored by all. And this is something that I don't think I've noticed before. But as we read through this chapter, I hope you noticed, look at verse 4. In verse 4, God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. He will chase after me, or after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. Down in verse 17, God says, as for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so they will go in after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, when I am honored through Pharaoh, through his chariots and his horsemen. Down in verse 25, he caused their chariot wheels to swerve. He made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians. Even these Egyptians know the Lord is working against them. And then down in verse 31, Israel sees the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, and that's what caused them to fear the Lord, believe in him and in Moses. God was honored through Pharaoh and these people. And this just shows us that whether it's through good things, like faith and obedience to God as his humble servants, he'll be honored in that. But God is also honored through devastating, life-ending destruction and judgment on his enemies. God is honored even in that, and maybe especially in that. He was honored in the destruction of those who had hardened their hearts against him. And then in the next chapter, in chapter 15, we see where the obedient, humble servants, they worship him and they praise him with this amazing song. And so we're going to see that he is honored by all regardless. He is honored by all, whether it's as a willing participant on the side of God, or if it's as a willful enemy of God, because of who he is, he will be honored by all. And then the last one that's really, the main message of Exodus 14 is that the Lord saves his people. The Lord saves his people. Remember at the beginning of this chapter, God knew exactly what Pharaoh was going to do. He knew exactly that he was going to come after them, and God wasn't scared. He wasn't afraid one bit. He knew exactly what Pharaoh was going to do, but he knew what he was going to do as well. And so we see where down in verses 13 and 14, Moses says, do not fear. Stand by and watch the salvation that your Lord is going to perform for you today. And he says, verse 14, the Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. And so we could start at the beginning of this chapter and then go to the end of this. Nothing that the Israelites did caused the saving for themselves. Not one thing that they did the saving. It was all God. From the beginning to the end of the chapter, it's just every single thing. God did the saving. He's the one who brought them where they needed to be. He's the one who brought the wind. He's the one who separated the camps. He's the one who made the ground dry for them to cross over all night long. He's the one who put them into confusion so that these really professional chariot drivers couldn't do it, made them run away, destroyed the Egyptians. God did all of that. God did every single bit of that. And so that's why when we get down to verse 30, where it says, thus the Lord saved Israel that day, we can just pound it and say amen. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. The Lord did all the work. All the work. He did all the saving. The Lord saves his people. And so based on these observations and this chapter, I think there's some application points for us today. I do believe that God works in our lives and he works wonders in our lives today. But I don't know if you go to Barren River Lake or some lake or stream somewhere and you stretch out your hands over it, if it's going to part like this. And so sometimes it's hard with passages like this to make direct applications, but I'm going to suggest some. And again, if we do this in a couple of months, same passage, there's probably going to be different ones. So the ones for today is, the first one is, let the Lord soften your heart. Let the Lord soften your heart. We talked just a few minutes ago about how God causes some hearts to harden and God causes some hearts to soften. We absolutely have the free will to make choices and choose whether to open up to God or to close off to God. And in the Pharaoh's life, he closed himself off to God. So when God tells him what to do and demonstrates his power again and again, he just became more and more hardened, more and more hardened. And so instead of looking at the evidence in front of him and softening his heart, he became more hardened. And so I think for ourselves too, we have to open ourselves up to God, soften ourselves first, and then let God change us. Let God soften us and let God change us. And that's exactly what the fruit of the Spirit is in Galatians 5, is it not? You know, it's all about if we walk by the Spirit, we're led by the Spirit, then there will be fruit of the Spirit in our lives. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And so that tells me that this isn't just for somebody who's never become a Christian before, saying, well, you need to soften your heart and then allow God to change you. This is for all of us who already are Christians. You know, if you've been a Christian for 1 year, have you softened your own heart and then allowed God to work on you and change you entirely so that you're different from the way you were 1 year ago? If you've been a Christian for 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, have you allowed God to soften you and change you? Because when I think about the list of the fruit of the Spirit, I have personally known people who call themselves Christians, who have been Christians for 50 plus years, who are not loving. They're not joyful. They don't have peace. They're not peaceable. They're not patient. Maybe they don't have self-control. Have we allowed God to soften us and change us entirely? Because if we're closed off, we won't let that happen. But if we soften ourselves and then allow God to change us, oh, he'll change us entirely. Just ask Caitlin from when we started dating to now. I mean, praise God for that. So let's let the Lord soften our hearts. Let the Lord soften our hearts. But the next one here is we need to let the Lord fight for us. Let the Lord fight for you. Here in Exodus 14, Moses said, God would fight for them while you keep silent. God overthrows the Egyptians with this amazing victory. And just a thought exercise, could you imagine if the Israelites tried to fight the Egyptians themselves? I don't think it'd go very well for them. I mean, these are people who had been enslaved for 400-ish years. You know, they're probably not in the best shape. They definitely didn't have any military training. And here's officers in every chariot. They would be completely and utterly demolished. On the other hand, what if the Israelites only called out to God, but then did not do what verse 15 says, where God says, why are you calling out to me? Go forward. What if they only cried out to God and then didn't move? We're not really told what would happen, but God says, go forward. He says, why are you calling out to me? Go forward. And so I think for us today, maybe we can get in situations where we're on either extreme. Maybe we want to fight our own battles for ourselves, leave God completely out of it. We're going to take care of it of ourselves. And if you're anything like me, you've tried that before and it didn't go very well. Or maybe we go to the other extreme and we say, well, I've cried out to God about it about 100 times today, which is great. I don't want to minimize that at all. That's great. But then we don't do anything about it. And when maybe God is saying, why are you calling out to me? Go forward. There's some stuff you should be doing about this on top of calling out to me. And the Israelites going forward in no way negated that God did all of the fighting. And so I just wonder sometimes if we do the same thing. I think the phrase is put feet to our prayers, right? Put feet to our prayers. I think this is a perfect example of this because they had to cross over, walk over. We need to put feet to our prayers. God fought the battle for them, but they still had to cross over. So let us never underestimate the power of God in our lives, and let's rely on him, lift up our prayers to him continually, but also let's go forward and let the Lord fight for us. And then the last one today, which is the same one as the end of the observations, is let the Lord save you. Let the Lord save you. We mentioned a few minutes ago how all of the saving that is done in this chapter, all of it, not one bit of it was because of the Israelites. Every single part of this story was the Lord saving his people. Nothing that they did was working for themselves to be saved. Nothing that they did was them earning their way for God to demolish these Egyptians in this way. And the same thing is absolutely true for us today. Did you notice that, or did you know that the crossing of the Red Sea is a shadow or a type or a symbol of New Testament baptism? Did you know that? But let's turn over to 1 Corinthians 10, please. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And we're going to end with this here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And as we're all turning over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, just for a little bit of context with what's going on here, Paul is using the Israelites actually as an example for what these New Testament Christians should not be doing. He's actually going to say that there's some evil things that they were doing, some practices that they were following that you do not need to follow. But here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, let's read the first 5 verses. First 5 verses. Paul says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers, talking about the Israelites, were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Verse 5, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. And so here in 1 Corinthians 10, in these first 5 verses, Paul calls the crossing of the Red Sea, he calls that a baptism. And he calls it a baptism into Moses. And if you remember, Moses was their intercessor. He was their mediator. He was their go-between for God and the people. And so God saved the Israelites from the Egyptians through this baptism. There was the walls of water and the cloud over them through this baptism. They were immersed in water. And in a very similar way today, God does all of the work in the baptism of Jesus Christ. God does all of the saving. Nothing about us being immersed in water is us having worked to earn it, us trying to work to earn it, but God is the one who does all of the saving. Just like the Israelites were told to go forward, we also have to go forward and be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins, but God is the one who does all of the saving. He does all of the work. So I just implore and urge you to let the Lord save you. And so this morning, if that means you've softened your heart, you want the Lord to fight your battles for you, and you want to let the Lord save you, and you've never been baptized, is today the day? Because we'd love for it to be. If you have come to read the scriptures and understand who Jesus is and what they say you need to do, we would love to do that, and just absolutely love to do that. But also, if you've become a Christian before, let's remember verse 5 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Let's read this again. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 5. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Paul is saying that they had all gone through that type of baptism when they crossed the Red Sea and God saved them, but then they were not well pleasing to God and they died in the wilderness. So just because we have been baptized, that does not mean that we have soft hearts and that we've allowed the Lord to change us. And whatever it might be, we need to let the Lord save us, whether it's never become a Christian before, we become a Christian, but we've struggled and turned away from God, or we have things in our lives that we need to make right. I just urge you to do that today and let the Lord save you. Let him be the one that does the work. And so if there's any need this morning for any type of spiritual struggle or anything that we can do, there's an opportunity right now to make your life right with God while together we stand and while we sing.